Hello, everyone. This is Kate Stillman with the Yogahealer Podcast, and I have the divine pleasure of talking with Lise van Susteren, who is the author, the co-author of Emotional Inflammation. I was reading your bio, and I fell in love with your work without knowing your background. I'm sure this happens to you. For me, it's really fascinating because I used to work in Washington, D.C. in climate change policy, in global warming policy back in the mid 90s, and I left because I realized I had to get out of policy work to raise human consciousness and really figure out how to go more from human evolution on a psycho-spiritual front than on the global policy front. And you're in DC, and you're a general and forensic psychiatrist, for those who don't know Lisa. In 2011, she co-authored The Psychological Effects of Global Warming on the U.S., Why the U.S. Mental Health System is Not Prepared. I was thinking the psychological effects of COVID on the U.S. would probably be a fairly parallel analysis, so we can get into like what's happening. So for those unfamiliar with Lisa's work, she is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at GW, George Washington University. I used to bike by GW every day between my climate change job and my other job. So fun to bring this home. She's a consultant to the executive branch of the U.S. government, profiling world leaders. So it seems like you're really intersecting this background of where does thought leadership intersect policy on mental health on a national level. Is that fair?
Wow, what a succinct and knowing way to describe things. Better than I could have done, I gotta tell you that. And Kate, knowing that in 10 years before I was involved in climate issues, it started in 2005, I ran for the US Senate in Maryland, that you were already biking past GW and concluding that what we really needed to do was recognize that it was a psycho-spiritual issue. Certainly, climate is a factor and a representation of our decline, I would say, and the psychological and spiritual, our psychological and spiritual nature, as well as our recognition of living in tune with the world that shaped us. But you were so far ahead of everybody else. How do you account for that? I wanted to turn around and ask you a question.
I guess by personality type, I'm a futurist. Which is why I was, and I had mentoring early on where I was in the wilderness, working in the wilderness. There's a program, there still exists, the program Student Conservation Association. And I met in that program, living in the wilderness, swinging a misery whip, building trail. I was with people that were already at global consciousness. So I had global consciousness by the time I was 16 from working with them and just understanding more of the planetary consciousness just from relationship, right? Because in relationship, consciousness is transferred and transmuted and transformed. And so I had basically by 16 just surrendered my life to planetary stewardship, I would say, or collaboration. And I had health issues. So in my healing journey, I was already in planetary consciousness. And so that brought me more into the dharma or the life purpose around climate. I studied in college. I was really looking at what are the international policy and economics around climate change. Like, what's the biggest issues, and then how do we look at that from a economic and policy perspective? And that brought me into that level of work. And then realizing that we had a consciousness issue was like, oh darn, it's harder. It's even harder than a policy issue. But I mean, what's crazy is now, like, so now you and I are both you released Emotional Inflammation. I'm releasing in 2 weeks a book called Uninflamed, where we highlight your work and the work of about 200 other either scientists or doctors or people on the policy front around this global inflammation issue. And I would like to know what the emotional inflammation, like when were you first really on it with the emotional and because it sounds like it was before 2011 when you published.
Correct. The conference that I had, which was the same name on the mental health toll, of inaction on climate was in 2009. It took a bit of time because I have a practice. It took a bit of time, and I worked with a fabulous friend and mentor, Kevin Coyle, who was vice president, still is, at the National Wildlife Federation on Education. And it was really Kevin's brainchild. I was sort of, at the time, still trying to scratch around in the barnyard, figuring out what I could do. And it was Kevin who really elevated this issue. I had been to Al Gore's training in Carthage, Tennessee. I was one of the first 50. And you're going to laugh, Kate, because, and maybe your audience will too, I'm so naive, really. And I guess I sometimes think, boy, you can take the girl away from the farm. Not that there's anything wrong with farms, but you can't take the farm away from the girl. How naive. I thought that all we would have to do was share the data about what we were doing to ourselves with the use of fossil fuels and a less use of resources. And everybody would say, oh my God. And we just start seeing the change. I'd go to a talk and expect carbon emissions would be going down right after. And well, progressively, I realized, boy, this is a bigger beast than I ever could have thought. And I'm mindful, without getting too shrinky about it, Freud said that we have a life force, which is Eros, but we also have a self-destructive force, and it was subsequently named Thanatos after the Greek god of darkness and death. And
Wait,
our
I'm sorry. How do you spell that?
Thanatos, Thanatos.
Okay. Thank you.
And Thanatos is alive and well, and we have shifted some of our consciousness about our self-destructive inclination into a sort of madcap, sometimes self-indulgent immersion in the moment. And I call it self-indulgent, but it's really not so much self-indulgent as I think culturally defined. We've got all these devices that keep focusing on us on the moment. No one sits at a bus stop and just looks off into the trees and muses. No one takes long walks between villages and thinks about the pace of life and understanding why we're here and purpose and takes a break. We're all quick, 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 quick. And our brains have gotten further and further away from the natural systems that define us. And I think that has caused an enormous amount of anxiety and a self-destructive component to that anxiety.
Yeah. I mean, I would say the scientific literature in the last 2 years is proving that it's leading to the degeneration of the human species in terms of neuroplasticity, in terms of cognitive function, in terms of DNA, conservation of intelligence, of the species intelligence being able to replicate into the next generation.
Boy, is it fun to talk to somebody like you. I'm usually pounding the table and shutting the dinner party down one of these days, but it sure is fun to be with a kindred spirit. Just a snippet here. I read recently that we are losing our sense of smell.
Oh,
And
yeah. You want to talk sense of smell?
yeah, so the
Sense of
reason
smell.
is that it really isn't being activated. Use it or lose it. We know that saying. And you are right about the cognitive functioning, because stress really can create, of course, in young people, long-term consequences to our cognitive functioning. There are not only developmental delays as a result of stress, but our memories, our intellectual functioning, our judgment, etc., can be permanently altered when we have especially stressful conditions. And we also know that stress in general, those are the long-term consequences. Stress in general can be passed on epigenetically. In other words, it transmitted from one generation to another. The person who has faced traumatic stress has an altered packaging of its DNA, and it codes more readily for stress. And this is injected into the next generation. And recent study, which I've not read, but says moms are more likely to transmit it to their girls and men to their boys. I'll have a look at that. But irrespective, the idea of stress being transmitted to future generations is a valid one. And third of all, think about it. When we've been stressed, are our decisions especially careful, well-reasoned, and evaluated in terms of our what we hold to be dear and true, etc.? No, it's much more likely to be impulsive and have a component of survivalism in it. And when I look at the ramifications, sociologic and political, economic, it's very clear that we are under stress going to make decisions that might reflect our willingness to trade long held values for promises of security, whether it's from a bully in politics or some social phenomenon or some economic situation. We're compromised.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it's so clear that if someone has the cross between physiological inflammation and emotional inflammation and the back and forth of those feedback loops is we're always talking about the same thing with inflammation, and that's short term thinking, short-term horizons, impulsive reactivity at the level of micro habits that self-perpetuate into continuing limiting options, more survival-based options than long-term growth horizons and growth options. So as a species, that leads to annihilation. Yeah.
Well, here's the other thing that is pretty sobering, and then we'll have to, before everybody runs out of the room, we're going to have to switch to something a little more upbeat because there's plenty of reasons to be upbeat. We
Yeah.
create the problem, we can fix it, but we'll
Yeah.
do that in a second. And I, experience this as you will. Certainly, we have overpopulation. We have a planet with limited resources. So the number of mouths we can feed, we can't have infinite growth. All right. So the Mother Nature, which a couple of years ago, I was thinking that we would have a pandemic. And indeed, I was talking to some young people who were talking about it. This is prior to the
Mhm.
actual pandemic. And I thought, maybe Mother Nature is just going to, like a big grizzly bear, take her paw and give us a whack with those
Yeah.
long now claws and that powerful arm and reduce our numbers with the pandemic. In some ways, nature is going after the invasive species, but the invasive species kind of mutated and figured out a new way to deal by giving us vaccines and treatments, which we're all immensely grateful for. But I see that Mother Nature was taking a little bit of a poke at us. And then I realized that my co-author, Stacy Colino, was just divine to work with. Gosh, we had fun
Mm.
writing this book. We only wanted to kill each other about 10% of the time, which I figured wasn't bad. And Stacy worked on a book called Countdown with an epidemiologist at Icahn School of Public Health. And they, at their labs there, and in conjunction with the lab in Israel, have found that due to environmental castration, which is the impacts of the environment on our fertility, which include higher temperatures, the fertility of American men, European men, and Australian men is down by 50%. You heard me right. It's down by 50%. And in addition, this infertility is passed on to future generations. So, maybe Mother Nature has got a much more elegant plan in mind,
Yeah.
which is just to prevent us from, as you suggested when you announced this particular theme, to reduce our numbers.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, right. I mean, it's all interconnected systems, and there's always more than one factor at work, right? So one of the things I heard, it was a really cool, like sort of like meta economic analysis of the macro global economy, like pre-COVID, hitting COVID, COVID economy, post-COVID economy. And it was just kind of this cool graph of like, if we look at the global economy numbers after the '08 recession up until about 2020, 2022, we have till about 2020, we have this growth, tech stock driven growth, right? Unsustainable, not connected to planetary intelligence. Year over year, quarter over quarter growth. And then you hit this wall of COVID where things stop and get redefined. And then we print all this money, which really messes with people's ability to find their work, like their true work, their true value of work in the world when you give kids candy. It usually leads to bad situations when you give adults money without providing value that have a similar outcome. So then you have this splintering. It's like it hits the wall, this growth economy hits the wall and it splinters into a K. So like the wall is the line down, and then the K is you have evolutionary communities that continue to grow based on value, and you have degenerating communities that will have all the factors that we've talked about, where you have maybe increase in lifespan, but decrease in health span, which is a really good differentiator. Health span is more or less defined by feeling healthy, regardless of age, without the support of synthetic chemicals or pharmaceuticals or surgeries, really. I mean, although it's not like super exclusive, but it's more or less like you figured out the human hacks of like how to thrive in crazy modern culture. And so your health span increases versus extended lifespan with chronic inflammation, which might be at this point symptomology or disease, depending on the system that you're looking from, in the way that they can rate the severity of the impact of the inflammation on your quality of life. So health span is high quality of life, right? Extended lifespan with these codependencies is low quality of life, but you're alive. So that's the degenerating. And so what we see is like, let's say 90% of people are in the degenerating communities post-COVID, where we have increase of emotional inflammation, we have increase of physiological inflammation. So we're going to see increase of chronic disease. The other 10% are just like having the party of their lives because like they're using technology. They've upsourced their psychology. They've upsourced their interconnected communities. They've truly bonded with growth people in growth communities. They're experiencing, like you described with your colleagues, like really phenomenal relationship, very much in the seat of the creator, knowing that they're co-creating the future together, and then seeing the differential between themselves and the majority, which seem to be falling deeper and deeper into the symptomology of chronic inflammation.
Yes, and I endorse all that you said, and it makes me think about the reality that we were shaped by the hand of nature, and the idea that we would stray from the hand that shaped us and think that we would flourish is only the hubris of the human species. Everybody else sticks to what we know works. And we have, and technology, I'm not a Luddite. Technology has certainly given us so much, but is now dominating us. And we are becoming the poor player that struts and frets the hour upon the stage, as Shakespeare would say. And technology is the apple of our eye. And this has become a problem because that's not how humans flourish. And what I love about the book and what was so much fun about the book, and I have to always confess that I pick it up if prior to an interview and start reading some of the stuff that I so carefully wrote about. And I get excited all over again. It's like this wonderful, beautiful, sparkly wave from a Caribbean beach comes sweeping over, and it dazzles me with all of the excitement about what restoring our connection to the way we were designed actually does. And it ranges from a gut microbiome that's healthy and doesn't get all these pesticides and chemicals. And finally, they're going after Monsanto Bayer for Roundup, which we talked about a decade ago, glyphosate, which causes.
Just released a podcast with Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who's a senior researcher at MIT who wrote the book on that and discusses the court case. So that was released last week.
Oh my gosh. Well,
now her research now is going to the side effects of mRNA vaccines.
Oh boy. All right.
We'll feature that in August. But yeah, no, back to what you're saying though. It's like, it's cool what's happening with these court cases, and people are going 100% organic, and it's driving industry. And that's, again, those evolutionary communities are getting that message of like, it's organic or destruct.
Okay. And this is where we get to the hopeful part. Yes,
Yeah.
Earth has climate tipping points, and boy, are we tempting that grizzly bear. But at the same time, and I don't want to characterize Mother Nature as a grizzly bear, I guess, but we have really provoked that image by our behavior, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. She's
And
everything, right? So
yeah,
she'll be
it's
everything.
physics, it's biology, it's chemistry. It's just the natural order of things that we have that believed that maybe that we could manage with an act of Congress or something else. And, we can't. So the excitement is that in addition to Earth's tipping points, which were really tempting, we also have cultural tipping points.
Mm.
And let's be honest, everywhere we look, the noise of people rising up and saying, what, is going on? We have to take action. They may not know exactly what action and they may be cowed about talking about it. But I joked a little earlier about shutting a dinner party down. I did a few years ago. But when I bring up climate now and the issues of the environment, I'm not getting that same frozen look like, why did you bring up a topic that no one is concerned about or knows anything about? People are responding. And within my community, the mental health community, I would get the deer in the headlights. What does climate have to do with mental health? God. But anyway, whatever. We're not getting that anymore. People understand. But what we need are leaders, thought leaders, maybe the people listening to your podcast, recognizing that it really is our leadership, whether we were born leaders or not, whether we're shy or shrinking violets, or whether we're like to strut around on the stage. It is now critical that we make our contribution, whatever it is, and to be mindful. People will often say to me, oh, what one person does doesn't matter. Well, of course, that's a cop out because we well know it, but the election day, which happens to be here today in Maryland, where I am, election day, yeah, we do cast a single vote, but they're counted together.
Yeah.
And it is our united voice that drives a market, that drives social norms and creates the momentum and reinforces the momentum that we need to see.
Yeah, I will build on this. So if everyone listening sees yourself as being a leader in every aspect of your life and every interaction in your day, what's phenomenal about this is that it reverses inflammation.
Right?
So, right?
Fancy that. Doing things that are consistent with how we were designed in ways that make us feel a sense of purpose, that are good for our mental health. Newsflash.
News flash. So the book I'm releasing, Uninflamed, there's 21 primal habits, and the primal habits, like prime numbers, are irreducible. So it's all based on the habits of human evolution, right? And how do we act those out in modern culture? They're all free. So they all make people money. Like, because you'll save money and you'll get smarter, so you'll make more money if you're interested in that. But they'll also turn you from consumer to creator, from consumer to citizen. And you've hit on both citizen and creator in your own,
And, and, and
life.
perhaps much more. We have had a real decline in our spirituality. And I'm not a person of faith, but I am a person who believes that there is a spirituality that is untapped and that we have lost this. The pondering of the heavens, certainly it's fun to see the Webb telescope out there, although all the excitement about the images, I don't know how to read those images. I got to tell you, I don't know what to say. They're gorgeous, but I don't know what to make of them. But that sense of pondering the heavens and of wondering what's out there that is different from humans or our forces that we don't know about, I think that this humbles us and that this is a very invigorating way to look at the world that helps us to forget about ourselves personally and individually, which neuroscience tells us that when we get too focused on ourselves, our behaviors and how we're doing we will ruminate, and that rumination really causes depression. Whereas on the contralateral side of the brain, without getting too neuroscience-y about it, what is activated that is particularly transformative is when we participate in thoughts about and actions involving a group, or in the experience of awe that comes often from collective action, from pondering things that we cannot always explain, And it not only triggers reward centers, but those reward centers even connect to opioid receptors, the body's natural painkillers. And we do have this sense of being kissed by the sublime. And that transformative, transcendent experience is something that is most often triggered by nature, but also when we are engaged in collective action with like minded individuals. So, a good reason for us to think about the larger universe, including the people around us.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I have the benefit of having gone from, again, from climate policy into Eastern spirituality and pathology as well. So in Ayurvedic medicine, there's a teaching of the five bodies, and it's really cool with what's emerging in neurochemistry right now in terms of what you're describing with the, how the habits of circadian rhythm, part of which is darkness and light, which is where you're no one and then you're someone. So no one is the night in the big sky and your smallness, and then daylight and you see you have a face. Is that there's five bodies. So we have a physical body, we have an energetic body, we have a mental emotional body, we have an intuitive body, and then we have a bliss body. And when we're optimized, that experience of the bliss body is the neurochemistry that we're now discovering, in terms of like when we get out of this like high beta brainwave state triggered, activated by stress, and that's on overload. And then we're getting adrenaline addiction, which is perpetuating that high beta brainwave state. And it's blocking out theta and delta brainwave states, which bring us into that collective awe, action. These are the subtler experiences of the sublime, which we can access in all these different ways. But we can't get there if we're in adrenaline addiction.
That's right.
And what I find in our healing courses is it's like when someone comes to heal with us, it takes about, so they may have a severe diagnosis that's got their attention, and now they're like on a healing journey and they're like, I want to get to the root. I want to reverse this. Is it usually takes like 3 to 6 months with us in a group before they hit that depth journey, like to go into Jungian psychology, where they hit the level of depth. I call it reckoning day, where they're like willing to deal with their adrenaline addiction, like willing to deal with that. Like they really can, they're real with it. It's somatic, which means the bliss body is now actually in communication of like, we're on empty here, but like we could wake up.
That is really fascinating because I have thought often adrenaline is an antidepressant and stimulant medication is very effective at treating depression. Of course, it's a very poor choice to treat depression, but what has been diagnosed as ADD or ADHD is, of course, undiagnosed depression and anxiety, largely. And I see my colleague giving out these prescriptions, and it makes me ill because it is, of course, reinforcing a very pathological culture. And not to mention the fact that it isn't treating the illness, it's also reinforcing the illness. And so what you say is really noteworthy and very, very interesting the way you've presented this as an addiction, the adrenaline addiction.
Well, what's interesting too about that, right? You take a kid. So right now, 30%, roughly, I guess it's 20% at the last measure, but my guess is that's an underestimate for mid 2022. So we'll say 30% of United States children under the age of, so basically in development, so under the age of 21, physiological development, are medicated right now. And so if we look at that, and if we look at, it's a household issue, it's a stress household issue that the adults are perpetuating into the culture of the child's life. And maybe it's not just the parents, it could be the school system, it could be any impact. And if that's really the core of the emotional inflammation that's then presenting, whether it's presenting as depression or ADD or autism or ectopic dermatitis, or those are the big ones, allergies, those are the big ones that children are medicated for. that's actually perpetuating the physiological. So we know that the drugs perpetuate the physiological inflammation, which then perpetuates the emotional inflammation. So they're in the negative feedback loop or the positive feedback loop that's going in a negative direction. I, but like it really gets to that, like, oh, wait, the whole family, if they could wake up to like, wait, what are the positive stressors? What's our meaning? What's our purpose? How do we want to use our time? How do we want to put a roof over our head? How do we want to live? How do we want to be? What do we want to do together? What do we want to co-create? Now all of a sudden, we have anti-inflammatory triggers happening at really at the psychological meat cellular level.
That is a very interesting what you're saying, and it prompts me to say that I think one of our key issues, this attempt to run away from reality, run away from our origins, run away from a deeper sense of meaning and purpose, is really a characteristic of recent times, especially because in the past, well, I'm not an expert on this, but we really try to deny our mortality, our vulnerability, the fact that we're going to grow old and die, etc. Death and senescence is now something very removed from our day-to-day life, our culture. We have retirement homes, we have care in those people die there rather than within the family. Older people are not included in a multi-generational setting, etc., where the evolution of life is a natural experience. We have made all of this unnatural, and I think that it has contributed to the anxiety and need to deny that we have emotions and vulnerabilities. And so we run and we take and ingest whatever we can to help us reinforce that distinction between ourselves as ideal, young, forever young, and on the other side of the fence, vulnerable and growing old. And I think that this is a cultural phenomenon that is, I used to work in Africa as a doctor,
Mhm.
and what a different experience where the reality of life and death was always all around us. There was a very grounded, certainly, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have all of the gifts that we have that medicine and technology are giving us. I want to reassert that, but it's gotten out of control. It is now it is now the cart before the horse. And we should be caring and careful about this, because if we're not, we will not, in my opinion, it's to our, oops, it's
Okay.
right. Someone knocked on the door. It is, it'll come out of our pockets.
Yeah, it's gonna come out of our organs after our pocket. Yeah. Yes. Oh my gosh, we could talk forever. I The key here is you have to pay attention, right? And so the modern if we think the sick care system can help, it's just first order thinking issue. We have to invest. I want to talk about death. I want to talk about birth, and I want to talk about young more and the archetype. The humans evolved, human psychology or cognitive function evolved out of archetypes. And that was, I feel like, Jung's main contribution and to understanding where the myths that are present in every native culture, in every First Peoples culture, like you experienced in Africa, is part of also our dream state. We all experience this in dreams. Like last night I had a dream. I was I was hosting a healer gathering, and all the healers came, and it was a big round table. It was like King Arthur's 13 Knights times 5, you know?
On
All everyone wanted to do was connect. It was very collective consciousness, exactly what you were describing before, like shape-shifting the future of paving the next way for human consciousness. And in the dream, my dog has a opposite, and the opposite is dead. And she pulls it out of the river and revives it. And so this is happening with the healer gathering, and a baby's born, and there's a baby born, that takes on the name of one of our we have like a whole community of healers at Yogahealer, and we have this Earth Mother healer who's very in it and not she would never describe herself that way, but she is that representation. And the baby takes on her name, and and the dead dog and the living dog are simultaneously coexisting. The baby's being born and the healers are paving the way through their
Right.
connective chatter into the future, like really just that edge where that upward line of the K of evolutionary communities goes into, and it's this familiarity. So it's like as we're drugging ourselves, we're not aware of our dreams and we're not aware of the death and the rebirth and these messages that come through the dreams. And then we make choices that prolong assisted living without engaging health span and without engaging what I find with my parents live a mile away. They both have had chronic diseases caused by inflammation, and have taken medication and they're expanding their lifespan. I and what's been so fascinating is like the levels of intimacy and connection as leaving their daughter and asking them, these really challenging yet safe questions to discuss. It's like that's what's so cool about death head on in books like what is it, Beyond Mortality, something like that, being mortal, where it's like engaging us and like, wait, no, like let's really live our life and let's really live our death. And like, let's really engage with the conversation of health span versus lifespan as families and decide how we want to invest our time, how we want to invest our attention, how we want to invest in our finances, knowing that like the sick care model is just going to expand lifespan without health span.
Indeed. And, I don't have answers for that, but I do believe that our recognition of what living in harmony with the way we were designed, and no doubt about that, will help us to get back on a path that is in sync with how we were shaped. And absent that, we're forever looking for home. And there's a reason that the salmon goes home to spawn. There's a reason that we stick with our natural habitats. And we have forgotten that. And there are all sorts of pressures on us that we don't know anything about. What does it mean when we go and take an airplane, aside from the carbon emissions, to get race from one side of the country to the other? Well, I don't know. We live in a magnetic field. What happens when we can change how our brain might react to pressures we can't yet identify? I have started taking the train now. I've had some forensic cases on the other side of the country, and I have seen the difference in the way I am when I see the miles unfold and the difference in the setting, the landscape as we go, and how this brings a certain peace to me. It's a restorative experience. I feel exhilaration when I take a plane. I feel young and strong and tough and cool and all the rest, but that's not necessarily the message. And I think that these kinds of things that we may minimize, taken as a collective whole, drive a culture in ways that we may never even have considered. This doesn't even address the issues that we do know. What's it like to see green? What's it like when we see fractals, meaning the different ratio of shapes in nature that actually stimulates centers that are responsible for balance in our brains? What happens when we hear sounds that are unnatural? In other words, human-made sounds that affects our amygdalas, our fight or flight centers, and they are experienced as microaggressions. So all of these things that we don't know about, the jackhammer, the horns, the this, the that, I don't mind these things, but the cumulative toll on me individually and collectively in the culture is something that we have minimized and at our own peril.
Yeah. Amen. So I was biking yesterday in the forest, and I'm in the Teton Mountain Range, and it was very windy. Those who understand the American West and climate change know that it's turning into a desert. So these gorgeous emerald forests are dying, and not just by fires, but just by like the root structures. So I'm biking in this aspen grove, and this aspen tree falls. This aspen tree falls right in my path. Like 2 seconds later would have probably taken out my dog or I, and I'm chewing on aspen leaves because I eat wild foods. Aspen leaves, baby aspen leaves are really high in antioxidants.
Wow.
They're not, the Native Americans didn't really use them. I mean, they used so many medicines that it wasn't like a choice medicine. It's not really a food. I found it to be an amazing medicine for
Wow.
me. So I'm chewing on aspen leaves. It's aspen falls, and aspens have a collected root system. And the aspen that falls is healthy and green and
Oh,
alive.
oh,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm just in the collective pain processing body of receiving and honoring the death and the life and the all of it. And how, I mean, for me, like, I think for the healers and the people listening, it's like we're so in touch. Like we're so being fed by the five elements. We're eating organic food. We're we're taking ourselves into nature. We're meditating. We're in it, and and we're in this reality of like our brethren, our brethren on the planet. And I will make a divide here. I are really in this just like impulsive profit at the expense of offspring of the species. And
yeah.
there's a sense of global mourning. And so, like, how do you balance that personally?
Yeah, as a collective attempt to run by putting an adrenaline poultice on the anxiety and depression I think that we feel at recognizing that we can't find. And so that's how I will account for some of that. But how do I do it? Well, not well, frankly. I We talked about some of the reactor types that I describe in my book. And one of the reactor types is the hyperactive reactor type, and I do it's a madly try to think up, or not try to think up, but I do engage in activities that involve, I hope, the restoration of some of the things that we have talked about.
Yeah.
I pushed colleagues to start a climate aware therapist directory because I was getting calls from people that they were turning to mental health professionals who would downplay their concerns about the environment and climate specifically and suggest that maybe it was something to do with work or family problems or something like that. So we got a climate aware therapist directory, but there was a lot of resistance at first. And now everybody's gung ho and thinking up ways to credential people, et cetera. And then now I have a climate hotline that I hope we've got a toll free number. It's not up yet, but it'll be 888 330 3131. And it will be for people to call in and talk about what we won't be offering therapy, but we'll be offering connection and sharing peer reviewed science and resources for people to take action to address the distress that they feel. And oh gosh, I've got all this pushback at the moment, but I have found that with many of the efforts that it's really it's the persistence. And so the way I deal with this is by closing my eyes to the objections and persisting and recognizing that I'll always have a few people behind me, but that changing the rest will have to come. And recognizing also that you don't need everybody. What you need are a few thought leaders, and then it reaches that magic cultural social tipping point, and what seemed impossible now becomes inevitable. So we started Climate Psychiatry Alliance, Climate Psychology Alliance, North America. And at first, we could count on one hand the people that were interested. Now we got people jumping in the boat. Well, Mother Nature has certainly contributed to the loss of our denial, but not everybody's yet on board. But oh, I do have to say one thing that I'm very excited about since you talk about policy. We meaning a number of petitioners, and maybe some people know James Hansen, who was the climate scientist who testified before Congress in 1988 on global warming. Jim Hansen and a couple of other petitioners and I went to the EPA a couple of weeks ago and delivered a petition. And please go to Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative, CPRI, to sign that petition if you'd like to declare that carbon dioxide is a toxic substance. Because in 1976 and then reinforced in 2016 by bipartisan existing law, The EPA is empowered to regulate a substance that presents an unreasonable risk of harm to our and that of the environment. And so we have petitioned them to declare carbon dioxide a toxic substance. Now, I don't know how you get out of that because it certainly qualifies, and they're the ones who it was this legislation that required action on asbestos, on lead paint. It is the underpinning to Superfund sites, the legislative underpinning to Superfund sites, chlorofluorocarbons. I mean, tell me how they're going to get around it. I don't know. But we've got our fingers crossed. If anybody cares to endorse that, again, this is a 501, all 501c3. Nobody's making any money off it. We're doing it because
This
of
is so
fun.
good. This
Isn't that fun?
so good. I
Isn't
wanna
that
do
fun?
I wanna do an episode just on that. This is so
Right?
great. Yeah,
Let's do
absolutely.
it.
Let's do
I
that.
got plenty
Yeah,
of
bring whoever you wanna bring. Yeah, you bring your team,
got
and
it.
we'll
We
do an
got it.
episode on this, and we'll get this out. This is huge, you guys. This is huge if we can get carbon dioxide classified that way. I mean, that's the game changer the United States policy needs. Okay, Lisa, our path is nowhere near done. I just realized I'm gonna be in Washington, DC in October, and we will meet in person.
Fabulous.
I can't wait. You guys need to go. We're going to put all these links in the show notes. You need to take the quiz on emotional inflammation, figure out which reactor type you are. It's super helpful. You might be more than one type of reactor type. It just will help you realize when you are. And I just really want to highlight what Lisa just said is that when you're reactive, the way you go from reactive to proactive is you do something and you connect with proactive people. I see this as the biggest shift from consumer into citizen and consumer into creator. Lisa, thank you for your work in the world. Thank you for your commitment in really showing up as proactive. So appreciate you.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to your listeners. What a pleasure and delight it has been for me to be with you all today.